Hi, it's Alice here. I produce Uncommon Sense, and in a moment you'll hear our episode on China, families and generations. But first, a quick word. The Sociological Review Foundation is a charity, and we're hard at work celebrating and sharing the importance of the sociological imagination. Uncommon Sense is a really important part of this, and if you're a regular listener, you'll know what we do. But we really want to know more about you. Why you enjoy this podcast, what you'd like to hear, what else you enjoy listening to, that kind of thing. And so in the show notes for this episode, you will find a link to a short, simple survey. And we'd be so grateful if you'd be happy to fill this out. Why not press pause and do it now? It will make a huge difference to us, and it may well shape what you end up listening to here. Thanks.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Uncommon Sense from the Sociological Review Foundation. I'm Rosie Hancock, joining you from Dresden in Germany.
And I'm Alexis Hutrong in Gatineau, Canada.
As ever, this is the show where we take an everyday notion or a word that usually gets used uncritically, maybe it's a bit misunderstood, or it's got lots of assumptions loaded into it. And we pause, examine it closely, flip it around a little bit with our guest, and come away seeing it in a new light, seeing it a bit more sociologically.
And today we're going pretty big because we're talking about an entire country, one of the world's biggest, China. And within that, the meaning and reality of family, modernization, and generations too.
And we're going to be doing this with Jieyu Liu, a sociologist at SOAS, University of London, whose new book, Embedded Generations, takes on some powerful and pretty deeply embedded assumptions. Those include ideas about what modernization has looked like in China, what rural and urban life look like, but above all, about how families work in China and how they've changed over time. Because as we'll hear in a moment, there's this powerful, very Eurocentric idea that relationships have been radically transformed with the progression of what you might call late modernity. So this is ideas about the fact that we have less obligation and therefore can achieve greater satisfaction, perhaps, that there's less dominance of factors like gender and class and more emphasis on negotiation and contingency. So all about individuality, self-actualization, that kind of thing. But maybe it's not quite so straightforward and not quite so uniform after all.
Jieyu's research saw her spend extensive time traveling in rural and urban China, leading to 260 life history interviews across 3 generations, all exploring how families have changed with time and how individuals have navigated courtship, marriage, intimacy, and aging. It led her to develop a concept called embedded generations, which will be at the heart of our conversation today.
Jieyu joins us from London. Hi, Jieyu. You grew up in eastern China in a small city, and I'm wondering, what did family mean to you then and to those members of your family who still live in China today?
Okay, so I grew up in eastern part of China, a city not far from Shanghai. And I lived with my grandparents and throughout my childhood and as well as my school years. The reason why such living arrangement was made is because of my education. My grandparents live in a neighborhood that has the best grammar school, the middle school in the whole city. And so that's why they took me in since I was born, so I could have the chance to enter that top school in the city. But the dominant memory of family to me at the time is that all the families are networks. There are very frequent interactions and exchanges between generations. Despite that, we live separately, and my parents came to see us almost every week, and there are so frequent exchanges between the 2 generations. So I don't have that sense of being nuclearized as many Western theorists would predict.
And so for the research we're talking about today, like you did 260 interviews across 3 generations, across urban and rural sites. And I think that was from like 2016 to 2023. And you were essentially seeking to understand the reality of family life since the Chinese Communist Revolution that culminated in 1949 when Mao Zedong declared the creation of the People's Republic of China. I'm keen to know more about your research questions, but maybe above all, like what motivated you, right? Because your work takes on some big name theorists, the kind of thinkers anyone who've picked up a sociology book in the noughties would be very familiar with, right? Did you have an inkling right from the start that this would be the case?
Yeah, empirically, I was very interested to find out how Chinese family life have shifted across 3 generations over time in China. But also, I was really struck by how dominant the discourse on individualization appeared in the Chinese academic circle for the family scholars. And I really wanted to find out to what extent individualization was taking place in Chinese family, because from my personal experience, that wasn't the case.
So I think, some of the thinkers that you are engaging with in your work and really pushing back this idea of individualization are people like Anthony Giddens in the UK and Beck Gernsheim in Germany. And I was wondering if you could outline these thinkers a bit more specifically and their influence, including in China, like how they've influenced the research on China.
Yes. In 1992, the book Transformation of Intimacy, Anthony Giddens outlined a kind of shift in the late modern time from romantic love to a pure relationship characterized by conflict love, in which that two individuals only stayed in a relationship as far as their erotic needs are met. So, and then in 2002, the book Individualization, Beck and Gernsheim put forward the idea that the contingency and the negotiation of the intimate relationships are shaped by the process of individualization. This process of individualization is associated with denormalization of roles and the decline of these formal structures like gender and class and kinship, etc. And their theorization have generated very robust debate within British sociology. There are a lot of critiques disagreeing with them. However, because of this asymmetric academic exchange in global academic circles, the theories from Giddens and Beck and Gernsheim were translated to Chinese society, but not the critiques. So their theory were taken up by some very influential scholars working on China. And through the translation of these scholars' work, the individualization theory has become the most dominant theoretical framework for family scholars within China. But they were unaware of those critiques and the alternative theorization existing.
I was wondering if you could help us understand individualization a little bit more. We've mentioned it a few times now. And would the idea be something like in the past, if I was, let's say, marrying someone, I wouldn't just be marrying that person, I would also, in a sense, be marrying into their family. And so I would become sort of bound to their parents and their siblings, and that there might be obligations that came along with that. And I would see myself as part of this much broader family unit, let's say. And perhaps that commitment, I'm in that commitment for life. It's this sort of deeply embedded relational commitment to a wide group of people beyond just the person that I have perhaps fallen in love with. Whereas now, I'm just making a commitment to the one person, and I don't know if I'm getting this right or not. So not necessarily, my partner's no longer necessarily has any obligation or duty towards my family. I don't have obligation or duty towards their family. And in fact, we only have sort of commitment and obligation towards each other for as long as it suits us. We are sort of operating as individuals that might couple for a period of time and then decouple as it suits us. Is this kind of what individualization means in the context of families?
Yes, this is what the individualization thesis is about. Yes. I mean, the core idea in the individualization theory, for example, there is a thesis called Individualization of Chinese Society. And some scholars outlined a kind of inversion of generational hierarchies in Chinese family, which predict a constant decline of parental authority and the constant increase of youth autonomy. And they credit this kind of transformation to the individualization. down to the personal desire, the pursuit of personal desire and autonomy in this process. But what I found, these kind of a linear prediction of this decline of parental authority and increase of youth autonomy didn't exist in the reality I observed through my fieldwork.
Hearing you talk, it kind of reminds me because I did my fieldwork in Tokyo. And when I was studying kind of the literature there also, I was able to read a bit more on how, for example, modernization in Japan was also trying to be thought outside of the West, right? And so I'd like to hear a bit more about these ideas that you said. We're traveling to China, for example, from Giddens and Beck and Beth Gernsheim, but without the critique. So you mentioned how certain researchers were using that to look at the transformation of autonomy and authority within the family. Can you tell us a bit more about the kind of analyses that scholars were having in China?
Yeah, the debate was within British sociology. So these scholars who utilize Beck's individualization theory, they were based in the United States. So probably that's why they didn't understand the whole debate where the critiques came from. So they only just applied Beck's individualization theory to the Chinese context. So that's how this concept was introduced to China, but without the critiques. And the Chinese scholars, because the translation of these scholars' work into Chinese, so the Chinese scholars only, again, because the language is a barrier, so they do not necessarily to read into the English debate. So they only look at the translations, but all the translations are predominantly based upon the individualization theory. They didn't see the other side. During my discussion with them, they felt there was something wrong with it, but they just couldn't pin down which point. That's why I feel it's the moment, it's the time for me to enter the debate and to collect more data to see to what extent the individualization is taking place in China.
Mm-hmm. To what extent, and also in what ways, right? And I guess it's pretty risky for ideas to travel without context and caveats and everything, especially when the social and political worlds are so different. And of course, China has it's had a very different 20th century than that experienced in Western Europe, where these theories emerge, right? The families you spoke to will have lived many huge experiences, upheavals, right? So the Great Leap Forward under Mao, the ensuing Great Famine, and the so-called Cultural Revolution. And after communism, the one-child policy and major economic and social reforms also. You write of generations, G1, G2, G3. Do these neatly map onto some of these big historical periods? Can you tell us a bit more about these three generations?
The generation in my book has two meanings. First is the familiar generation, because these three generations are from the three generations of one extended family, like grandparent generation, then the parents' generation, and then the grandchildren's generation. But at the same time, they are quite roughly mapping onto the historical events. And for example, the G1, the grandparent generation, were born in the 1930s, 1940s. So their formative years and their working years exactly happened in the Mao era. So they will experience the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. So these are the historical events that shaped the experience of the G1 generation. And then the middle generation, they grew up in the 1960s, 1970s, and most of them got married around the 1980s. That's the early reform era. So they experienced the post-reform economic restructuring, the redundancy, and a lot of the events tailored to that. And also the G3 is the grandchildren's generation. They are exactly came into the period when the one-child policy was put in place. So in the urban families, predominantly the G3 are only one child. But in rural China, it's different because the one-child policy was modified in rural China since 1980. So these are the picture of my three generations in my book.
But I'm curious whether, across these three different generations, we've just sort of highlighted some of the ways in which there are contextual differences across those generations. Whether we're talking about people that experience communism under Mao, with the ones that grew up during economic restructuring or under the one-child policy and so on. So there's pretty big sort of contextual differences. But I'm curious whether you also found continuities as well. I'm especially interested as a sort of a sociologist of religion about the enduring power of Confucianism in China. I was hoping that you might be able to introduce us a little bit to what Confucianism is, because it doesn't necessarily fit into the definition of a standard religion that people who grew up on Christianity would necessarily associate. It doesn't have, it's quite different. So, what is it in its core tenets? But really importantly, the role that it played in the evolving norms around family life since 1949.
Thank you. I mean, Confucianism was one of the most dominant school of thought in Chinese philosophies, because Confucianism was elevated into become the orthodox of the state governance since the Han Dynasty for 2,000 years. So it has a lot of influence in terms of structuring how family relationships were organized. But there is in the 20th century, there is paradoxical relationship between the Chinese intellectuals and reformers with Confucianism. Initially, at the beginning of the 20th century, many Chinese intellectuals starting to criticize Confucianism. They felt Confucianism was the source of China's weakness in its interactions with the Western powers. For example, China's defeat in the Opium War. They all felt it's the Confucian ideas basically prevented China to move as fast as the other countries. So there was a lot of attack upon Confucianism in the earlier 20th century. However, the effect was very limited, because a lot of the ideas, promotion of freedom in marriage and freedom in love and sexuality, these practices only practiced by the urban elites, very, very small circles, didn't affect large population of the Chinese society. The real reform of gender relations, family relations came since 1949, when Chinese Communist Party took over China. So the party state had issued a lot of legislations trying to attack this Confucian idea and trying to induce an ideology of equality, diluted the power of the parents, instead to give the power to the younger generation of the family. However, what I found out is that the Chinese institutions are neither traditional nor modern. Instead, they are a mixture of both. For example, in the Mao era, on the surface, you see a very strong attack on the Confucian ideas. But at the same time, the Chinese government also legislated that there is a family obligation to continue to support. This is what, after all, is a Confucian idea for adult children have the obligation to support their parents, but also extended that obligation from the sons traditionally to the daughters. You see these contradictory ideas. And again, in the post-Mao China, you see a lot of revival of reuse of the Confucian discourse in the state policies, and since the 21st century, you see again these Confucian discourse reappeared in the Chinese leaders' speeches, like the emphasis on harmony, again Confucian idea, and then the emphasis on family values again reappeared in the last 2 decades in a lot of the leaders' speeches. So it's very paradoxical relationship with the Confucianism, and I can say there are a lot of legacies of Confucian ideas influencing contemporary Chinese practices.
So as you've mentioned, you set out to do interviews to capture reality on the ground, what norms and values were really in play, how family life was negotiated and narrated, where these continuities were, and the shifts across generations. Methodologically, like during my own PhD, I basically moved from my parents' basement in Canada to Tokyo on the other side of the world to start a 2-year ethnography, entering new spaces, meeting new people. It was really intense. I wanted to hear more about what it was like for you to enter the field work, right? Because you did so many interviews, right? And to engage with these families and talk about their intimate lives, for example, gaining their trust. Can you tell us a bit more about that experience?
It is very difficult in a way, because Chinese families, during the initial encounters, they all tended to present themselves as very harmonious and happy family to comply with what is expected in the public space. So I did a lot of repeated visits. And so gradually, I build a rapport with them. And so the family members I encounter, sometimes they treat me as a very close friend, so they can confide in things to me. So it's over time, like the conflicts or secrets started to emerge. It's definitely not a one-off thing. So this is, I would advise all the scholars who want to study families, you need to conduct it over an extended period of time.
So, I mean, it seems like you were definitely able to build a whole lot of trust, because I know I mean, it's just such a huge project with so many interviews. It's very impressive. So talking to all of these people about, how they made and make marriage decisions and so on, led you to offer your own concept, which is embedded generations. And could you explain that for us?
Yeah, thank you. The embedded generations entail three related processes. So the first process I want to describe is each generation's family practice is shaped by the material and institutional context of their time. And the second layer, what I'm saying, that each generation does not stand on its own. Instead, each generation serves as a bridge for intergenerational transmission and negotiation. And finally, what I want to emphasize that the individuals, they are occupied in different kind of positions and confined by their position in the community and family and the society. Therefore, the process, each individual respond to these kind of intergenerational negotiation or how to respond to the societal changes. The processes are very uneven because individuality is positional.
The work you've done, it really speaks to me in a way. Like my own father was born in Vietnam in the 50s, so my grandfather was born there. He moved during the war. I was born in Canada, and so on. So some of the dynamics that you're explaining, it speaks to me in various ways. I was wondering, based on the explanation that you gave of embedded generations, could you give us an illustration, a case study from the families that you met with that would be especially helpful for people who are not as familiar with the context to understand the kind of changes that happen, but also the continuities?
Yeah, let me give you an example. So this is one three-generational extended family in the city of Tianjin, and they are talking about their courtship experiences. So, for example, the grandmother, she recalled her courtship experience in the 1960s, Mao era. And from her account, she demonstrated how she fell in love with her colleague, who was also an apprentice at the time. But because they were colleague, family background is from a small business family, but her family was kind of classified as revolutionary army family. They were encounter a lot of difficulties from the workplace superior, and the workplace superior trying to make her to break up with her boyfriend at the time in order to admit her to become a party member. But she defined the meddling and insisted on getting married to her husband. But in the end, she never actually got the chance to become a party member. So she stayed as a worker throughout her life. So the embedded generations to show how each generation's their experience really defined by the characteristics of the era of the time. And then we move on to the middle generation. Her daughter was born in 1968. So her courtship experience, she described as the 1980s, early reform era. She met her husband through dancing because it was the fashion at the time for urban youth to visit dance halls after work. And then the grandson's generation. So the grandson recalled that he had multiple girlfriends. Again, the 21st dating scene in urban China reflected the institutional context of his generation, of the one-child generation. But then we can also see the continuities because there are a lot of intergenerational transmission of values. What I found out, a very widely held view across the three generations that Chinese marriage is not only just the two people coming together, they are also the union of two extended families. So there are a lot of emphasis on obligations towards each other, but also to each other's family. This is a widely held view across three generations. What I also found that the love is not blind, and there is a strong tendency to marry someone from compatible background. For example, across these three generations, their spouse they chosen is always from an urban family. So urban families tend to marry someone from urban family background, and rural family tend to find someone from a rural family background. And also you can see there is no linear transition from like traditional to modern, because you see the grandmother was very kind of romantic, presented very romantic. She defined the Madeline effect of workplace superior in order to marry someone she fell in love with. So I couldn't see a very linear transition from traditional to modern.
You know, thinking about this love is not blind idea, I feel like what you were just saying then is making me think about, you know, what marriage and relationships, romantic relationships are actually really about, and the role that love plays in them ever, and sort of in any context, actually, because I'm wondering whether love is ever blind anywhere, even when it claims to be or when we think it might be. You know, like, are we all in some respects a product of the context that we're in, and our who we fall in love with and who we're able to fall in love with is shaped by that context? And, you know, is there something just a bit more honest maybe about the Chinese context? I really love there's a concept that shows up in your work, Jiangzhu, which you write means making do. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, okay. The first point about these love is not blind. I think the Chinese were very explicit because there is a matching household. It's a pre-modern Chinese idiom that has really continued into being used to the present day. People were very clear we need to find someone who is from a compatible background as well as they're from compatible family background. And I think in the West, there is a lot of talk about romantic love. And in a way, I do think there are studies found that even in US, in the UK settings, these kind of associative mate selection process still take place. So people from middle class background tend to marry someone from a middle class background as well. And the concept on the jiangjiu is a Chinese term to describe this process. You really don't like, but because the external constraint, you just have to continue that kind of life. So this is really convey this kind of message. I think in the first two generations, this is very strong because a lot of them, I asked the question to every interviewee, if you were given the chance to relive your life, would you choose the same spouse? I think 90% of them will say no, but many of them will stay in their marriage because the family obligation towards your older generation, also towards your children, they stay in that marriage. For the younger generation, I found really interesting patterns because you see a lot of journalist reports saying that the Chinese divorce rates are rising. Yes. But what I found that from my interviewees, the people who are most in a position to initiate a divorce are those younger ones, those who in their 20s who just got married and have no children. But even for the G3, the grandchildren generation, when they reach their middle age, I see a lot of conversions in terms of their attitudes towards family and commitment with the earlier generation. They will really hesitate if their children in their school years, they will hesitate whether to go through divorce or not.
You know, I think a crucial lesson here is that people, these sort of people that you've been interviewing but people everywhere, you know, often don't map nicely onto macro theory, that there's always something else to think about or to attend to. And, you know, your work also makes me wonder, as researchers, we're often too eager to find the really distinct things or the changes or the ruptures, and maybe we need to attend more to continuity and nuance. So we're going to be back with you all in a moment, and with you too, Jieyu, to hear about a pioneering thinker who has shaped your thought.
Hi, it's Alice. I produce Uncommon Sense. Thank you for joining us to hear Jieyu Liu talking about China, families and generations. If you're enjoying this, do scroll right back through our archive to Series 1 to hear Catherine Twomley in our episode on intimacy. She talks to us about how a trip to India got her thinking about the varied meanings of love across cultures and contexts, and also what it could mean to decolonise love and why we should be wary of acts performed in its name. That's in our show notes, where you'll also find a link to our donor box page, where you can donate to directly support the making of this show. As we always remind you, we are a charity committed to celebrating and promoting the sociological imagination, and we are extremely grateful for your support. Thanks for listening.
Okay, Jieyu, here's where we ask our guests for someone who's given them some uncommon sense, who has shaped their thinking, right? And today, you want to profile a pioneering and very prominent Chinese anthropologist and sociologist, Fei Xiaotong, born in 1910 and died in 2005. He was educated in China and the UK, including with the famous anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski. He also advised economic reformers post-Mao. But his incredible life was also marked by tragedy and hardship. It ranges from his wife falling to her death while seeking to help to release him from a tiger trap just over 100 days after their wedding, to being banned and sentenced to hard labor under Mao. Can you tell us who this man was, his academic significance, and his story in terms of ideas?
So Fei Xiaotong was a pioneering researcher and can also be considered as one of the founders for Chinese sociology and anthropology in China. So draw upon fieldwork experience of the 1930s village life in China, and he put forward this model of a differential mode of association. In this model, basically, he argued that the individuality is relational. So one person can display very individualistic attitudes and behavior towards someone who is located more distance towards the self. But at the same time, the same person can display more collective or these kind of attitudes and behavior towards people who are considered closer to the self. This is called differential mode of association. What I found the most striking is a lot of his theorization about individuality has striking similarities with a lot of the critiques put forward by the British sociologists on the individualization theory. For example, by scholars Carol Smart and Stevie Jackson, they were arguing the individual are social and they are relational. These kind of relational selfhood has a lot of commonality with Fei Xiaotong's theory. I mean, Fei Xiaotong was inspirational for me. First of all, Fei himself was educated in China and in the UK, so he was well versed in Western theories and concepts. But at the same time, he was very good in doing field work. He grounded all his analysis and theorization from these solid, extended field work research.
And could you talk us through one of his key works, perhaps Peasant Life in China, which was a very famous work, and came out in 1939, or one that you would recommend most?
I would consider is one of his most influential work. I still think a lot of things he theorized in that book can apply to the understanding a lot of contemporary practices. He actually, in many ways, is kind of village ethnography. So he was choosing one of the villages he was very familiar with in the Jiangsu province. And in the different chapters were organized about different aspects of village life. For example, on marriage, on the relationship between adult children and the parents, and on the economic life in the village. So from reading the whole book, you will have a very vivid memory, a vivid picture of how the village life was carried out.
Jieyu, earlier in the episode, right, we talked about how some thinkers had traveled from the West to China, right, in terms of analyses and so forth. And Fei Xiaotong's work has been very influential inside of China. I'm kind of wondering if you could tell us a bit maybe about what current students in sociology and anthropology might learn from his work and from that person, what they could take as they're becoming, sociologists and anthropologists?
I think within Chinese sociology, anthropology, so all the Fei Xiaotong's works are kind of on the essential reading list for all the Chinese sociology and anthropology students. And his concepts about individuality, about the social governance in China, it becomes the foundation for a lot of theoretical discussions in China. However, I'm not sure his work is widely recognized in Western sociology. But again, this is to speak to the asymmetric academic exchange on the global scale. So there is a tendency to prioritize those concepts and theories derived from the Western concept, which have kind of assumed universalistic implications. But those of us who are doing study beyond the Western region were considered as area studies, do not necessarily have the kind of universalistic implication. But I do encourage, for example, family scholars of other societies to have a look whether a lot of things I argued for the Chinese families can actually be applied to other societies as well.
And for people who are curious to read some of Fei Xiaotong's work, we're going to have links in the show notes along with our usual rich kind of repository of resources available. And finally, Jieyu, we often ask our guests at this point in the show what we can read or watch or listen to get a better understanding of our subject that we've been talking about today. And I'm curious to know if there's anything that comes to mind for you. But in addition to that, so in addition to any recommendations you might have, what your views are generally on how China gets represented in the media that you encounter in the UK, for example, like what's missing or what needs amplifying or remedying?
I think sometimes I do get frustrated when I read newspaper reports about China. China is such a huge country and so complicated in terms of the urban-rural divide and also the regional variation. I just hope in future probably there will be more nuanced reports about China rather than making any sweeping generalizations. In terms of any books, I would highly recommend some of the Penguin translations of the Chinese literature. They're really good. During Christmas break, I was reading one of the kind of autobiography written by a scholar in Qing Dynasty. It's called 6 Records in a Floating Life. So basically, this person described his everyday life, including family, his relationship with his wife, with his parents, and his hobbies, really provide a very vivid picture how the life in Qing Dynasty appear. But the most thing striking me is that a lot of the things he described showed resemblance to a lot of the stories I heard from my interviewees. So again, this disrupt this kind of notion of pre-modern or contemporary, these kind of linear progression model.
Jieyu, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure.
That's all from us this month. There is so much to reflect on here, and we're going to put a whole lot of essential reading in our very rich show notes as ever.
And remember, you can check out our archive over on the podcast page on the Sociological Review Foundation website. There, you'll also find our manifesto, a great rallying call for why sociology is as essential as ever.
And don't forget, we're a charity. If you'd like to directly support the making of this show, head over to donorbox.org/uncommonsense, where you can make a one-off or repeat donation. It is all very gratefully received.
We'll be back with you next month talking about Frantz Fanon.
Thanks for listening. Bye.